Picture this. You're walking through the streets of medieval London in 1348. The smell hits you first. A nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting meat, and death itself. You step over a pile of animal entrails thrown from a butcher's shop, dodge a stream of urine cascading from a second-story window, and watch as a neighbor dumps their family's excrement directly onto the cobblestones where children play. This isn't some exaggerated horror story. This was daily life for millions of people in medieval cities. Urban environments so filthy, so disease-ridden, and so fundamentally broken that they literally killed their inhabitants faster than the countryside could replace them. Today, we're diving deep into the horrifying reality of why medieval cities were nothing short of death traps. Welcome to the darkest chapter of urban history. For centuries, medieval cities across Europe became concentrated hellscapes of human misery, where basic sanitation was non-existent, disease ran rampant, and death lurked around every corner. These weren't just inconvenient places to live, they were systematic killing machines that claimed lives through a toxic combination of ignorance, poverty, and social collapse. From the cramped, filthy streets of Paris to the plague-infested alleys of Florence, medieval urban centers represented humanity's first large-scale experiment in concentrated living. And it was a catastrophic failure. Today, we'll explore exactly why these cities became death traps, examining the horrifying conditions that made medieval urban life a nightmare. The toilet crisis. Let's start with the most fundamental human need: waste disposal. In medieval cities, this basic necessity became a public health catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Most city dwellers had no access to proper toilets or sewage systems. Instead, they relied on chamber pots, which were regularly emptied by simply throwing the contents out windows onto the streets below. The cry of "Gardez l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," became a common warning as residents hurled their liquid waste from upper-story windows. But this wasn't just urine. Chamber pots collected all human waste, including feces, vomit, and other bodily fluids. This toxic mixture would splatter across narrow medieval streets, creating a permanent layer of human waste that pedestrians had to navigate daily. Public latrines, where they existed, were horrifying structures that often consisted of nothing more than wooden seats suspended over rivers, ditches, or simple pits. These facilities were shared by dozens or even hundreds of people, creating perfect breeding grounds for disease. The waste would accumulate in these pits for months, creating toxic, bubbling masses that emitted deadly gases. In London, the situation was so dire that the Thames River essentially became an open sewer. Citizens would relieve themselves directly into the river, the same water source used for drinking, cooking, and bathing. The concept of treating water or understanding contamination was completely foreign to medieval minds. Waste disposal extended far beyond human excrement. Medieval cities had no organized garbage collection, no waste management systems, and no understanding of hygiene. Citizens simply threw their refuse into the streets, creating massive piles of rotting organic matter. Food scraps, dead animals, broken pottery, and household waste accumulated in the streets for weeks or months. Butchers would discard animal entrails, blood, and bones directly outside their shops. Fish vendors would leave rotting fish remains scattered across market squares. Tanners would dump chemical-soaked animal hides and toxic materials wherever convenient. These garbage heaps became breeding grounds for rats, flies, and other disease-carrying vermin. The organic waste would decompose slowly, creating a permanent stench that permeated entire neighborhoods. During summer months, the smell became so overwhelming that wealthy citizens would flee to the countryside, leaving the poor to endure the toxic environment. Perhaps most deadly of all was the contamination of water supplies. Medieval cities had no understanding of water treatment or the connection between contaminated water and disease. Citizens drew their drinking water from the same rivers and wells that received human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff. Wells were often located dangerously close to cesspits, allowing human waste to seep directly into drinking water. Rivers that flowed through cities became toxic streams of sewage, chemical waste, and decomposing organic matter. Yet these same rivers provided water for drinking, cooking, and food preparation. The situation was made worse by various industries that dumped their waste directly into water sources. Tanners used toxic chemicals and disposed of animal remains in rivers. Dyers released poisonous chemicals that contaminated entire watersheds. Brewers and food processors contributed organic waste that accelerated bacterial growth. The bubonic plague, the ultimate urban killer. No discussion of medieval urban death traps would be complete without examining the Black Death, the plague pandemic that killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in the 14th century. The plague thrived in medieval cities precisely because of the horrific sanitary conditions we've described. The bubonic plague was transmitted primarily through fleas that lived on rats. Medieval cities, with their mountains of garbage, open food storage, and complete lack of pest control, provided perfect habitats for massive rat populations. These rats lived in close proximity to humans, sharing homes, food stores, and even beds. When the plague arrived in European cities around 1347, it spread with terrifying speed. The disease could kill within days, causing victims to develop painful black swellings called buboes, high fever, and often death through blood poisoning. In some cities, the death rate reached 60% of the population within a single year. The plague's impact was magnified by urban crowding. Families lived in single-room hovels, sharing beds and breathing the same air. When one family member became infected, the entire household would typically follow within days. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, creating additional sources of contamination. Water contamination led to regular outbreaks of cholera and dysentery, diseases that killed through severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. These diseases were particularly devastating because they attacked the digestive system, causing violent vomiting and diarrhea that could kill within hours. Cholera outbreaks were cyclical, returning to the same cities year after year as contaminated water sources remained untreated. The disease would sweep through neighborhoods, killing indiscriminately. Children and elderly residents were particularly vulnerable, often dying within a single day of symptom onset. Dysentery, caused by bacterial contamination of food and water, created a slow, agonizing death. Victims would suffer weeks of bloody diarrhea, severe abdominal pain, and gradual dehydration. The disease was so common in medieval cities that it was often considered a normal part of urban life. The combination of overcrowding, poor hygiene, and lack of clean clothing created perfect conditions for typhus, a disease transmitted by body lice. Medieval city dwellers rarely bathed and often wore the same clothes for months, creating ideal breeding grounds for lice populations. Typhus caused high fever, severe headaches, and often death through organ failure. The disease spread rapidly through families and neighborhoods, particularly during winter months when people crowded together for warmth. Entire city blocks could be wiped out by typhus outbreaks. The disease was particularly devastating in poorhouses, prisons, and tenements where dozens of people lived in single rooms. These overcrowded spaces became death traps where typhus could spread to every occupant within days. Viral diseases like smallpox and measles were constant threats in medieval cities. These highly contagious diseases spread rapidly through crowded urban environments, killing children at alarming rates. In some cities, child mortality rates reached 50% before age 5. Smallpox caused horrific scarring and disfigurement in survivors, but more commonly led to death through complications like pneumonia or blood poisoning. The disease was so common that parents often didn't name their children until they survived their first smallpox outbreak. Measles, while less deadly than smallpox, still killed thousands of urban children annually. The disease weakened immune systems, making victims vulnerable to secondary infections that often proved fatal in the unsanitary conditions of medieval cities. Overcrowding. Beyond imagination. Medieval cities were characterized by extreme overcrowding that created deadly living conditions. Entire families, often including extended relatives, would live in single rooms measuring no more than 10 by 12 feet. These spaces served as bedrooms, kitchens, workshops, and animal shelters simultaneously. Buildings were constructed with no consideration for ventilation, natural light, or basic safety. Windows were rare and small, creating dark, airless spaces that trapped moisture, smoke, and disease. Many buildings had no windows at all, relying on open doors for light and air circulation. The lack of space meant that people lived in impossibly close proximity. Children shared beds with parents, grandparents, and siblings. Privacy was non-existent, and personal hygiene was virtually impossible. These conditions created perfect environments for disease transmission. Medieval urban buildings were constructed hastily and cheaply, often with no regard for structural integrity. Multi-story buildings were built on inadequate foundations, creating constant risks of collapse. Upper floors would be constructed with overhanging designs that blocked sunlight from reaching street level. These buildings were death traps waiting to happen. Wooden structures built too close together created perfect conditions for fires that could consume entire neighborhoods within hours. The Great Fire of London in 1666 demonstrated how quickly medieval urban areas could be completely destroyed. Building collapses were common, particularly during winter months when accumulated snow and ice added weight to already weakened structures. Entire families would be crushed or trapped in collapsed buildings, often dying slowly from their injuries. The most desperate urban residents lived in cellars and basements that flooded regularly with sewage and groundwater. These underground spaces were cold, damp, and completely dark, creating perfect conditions for respiratory diseases and depression. Cellar dwellers often shared their spaces with rats, insects, and other vermin. The constant moisture led to mold growth that caused respiratory problems and allergic reactions. Many residents developed chronic coughs, breathing difficulties, and lung infections that eventually proved fatal. Children who grew up in these underground spaces often developed rickets and other diseases caused by lack of sunlight and poor nutrition. The psychological effects of living in constant darkness and filth were equally devastating. Medieval city markets were breeding grounds for foodborne illnesses. Meat was sold without refrigeration, often sitting in open air for days before purchase. Fish vendors would sell products that had been dead for a week or more, creating serious risks of food poisoning. There were no food safety regulations, no health inspections, and no understanding of bacterial contamination. Vendors would sell meat that was visibly rotting, milk that had gone sour, and bread made with contaminated flour. Consumers had no way to assess food safety beyond visual inspection. The combination of warm temperatures, lack of preservation methods, and poor hygiene created constant risks of food poisoning. Entire families could be killed by consuming contaminated meat or dairy products. Food adulteration was rampant in medieval cities. Bakers would add sawdust, chalk, or other inedible substances to bread to increase profits. Brewers would water down beer and add dangerous chemicals to improve flavor. Milk vendors would dilute their products with contaminated water. These practices weren't just fraudulent, they were deadly. Chalk and sawdust could cause serious digestive problems. Chemical additives could cause poisoning or organ damage. Watered-down products often introduced contaminated water directly into the food supply. Grain storage in medieval cities was primitive and dangerous. Wheat, barley, and other grains were stored in damp conditions that promoted mold growth. Ergot, a fungus that grows on grain, could cause ergotism, a condition that led to hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Entire neighborhoods could be affected by ergot poisoning when contaminated grain was used for bread production. The condition was so common that it was known as Saint Anthony's fire and was considered a divine punishment rather than a preventable disease. Medieval cities were home to numerous industries that created toxic environments for residents. Tanning operations used dangerous chemicals and produced horrific odors that could be smelled for miles. These chemicals contaminated water supplies and created serious health hazards for workers and nearby residents. Metalworking industries released toxic fumes and heavy metals into the air and water. Lead poisoning was common among workers and residents living near these operations. The cumulative effects of heavy metal exposure led to neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Textile production involved the use of harsh chemicals for dyeing and processing. These chemicals were dumped directly into rivers and streets, creating toxic environments that affected entire neighborhoods. Most urban manufacturing took place in small workshops located within residential areas. These workshops were poorly ventilated, overcrowded, and filled with dangerous equipment. Workers, including children, labored in conditions that regularly caused injuries and deaths. Blacksmiths worked with open fires and molten metal in enclosed spaces, creating risks of burns, smoke inhalation, and building fires. Potters worked with lead-based glazes that caused systematic poisoning. Textile workers developed respiratory problems from inhaling fibers and chemical fumes. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in dangerous industrial conditions. They operated machinery, handled toxic chemicals, and worked in spaces that were hazardous even for adults. Child mortality rates in industrial areas were significantly higher than in other parts of the city. Children who survived industrial work often suffered permanent injuries, respiratory problems, and developmental issues. The combination of malnutrition, dangerous working conditions, and lack of medical care created a generation of disabled and chronically ill young people. Medieval cities created extreme poverty that trapped residents in deadly conditions. The majority of urban dwellers lived in complete destitution, unable to afford basic necessities like food, shelter, or clothing. This poverty created a cycle of disease and death that affected entire communities. Families would sell their children into servitude or prostitution to survive. Parents would abandon infants they couldn't feed. The elderly and disabled were left to die in the streets. The social fabric of these communities was completely destroyed by the struggle for survival. The desperation of medieval city life led to extremely high crime rates. Murder, theft, and assault were common occurrences. The lack of effective law enforcement meant that violence was often the only way to resolve disputes. Public executions were common entertainment, reflecting the brutality of urban life. Criminals were tortured and killed in public squares, often for minor offenses. The constant threat of violence created additional stress and trauma for urban residents. The horrific conditions of medieval city life created widespread mental health problems. Depression, anxiety, and psychological trauma were common but unrecognized and untreated. Many residents developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder from the constant exposure to death and violence. The lack of understanding about mental health meant that people suffering from psychological problems were often treated as criminals or possessed by demons. This created additional suffering and social isolation for those who needed help most. Medieval medicine was based on superstition, religious belief, and fundamental misunderstandings about human physiology. Doctors believed that diseases were caused by bad air or divine punishment, leading to treatments that were often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was a common treatment for almost every condition, often weakening patients and making them more susceptible to infection. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, creating high mortality rates. Many patients died from infections caused by medical treatment rather than their original conditions. Most urban residents relied on herbal remedies and folk medicine for health care. While some herbal treatments had genuine medicinal value, many were completely ineffective or actively harmful. Quack doctors sold dangerous potions and treatments that promised miraculous cures but often caused additional suffering. The lack of medical regulation meant that anyone could claim to be a doctor or healer. Many practitioners had no training whatsoever, leading to treatments that were based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Childbirth in medieval cities was extremely dangerous for both mothers and babies. The lack of sterile conditions, qualified midwives, and medical intervention led to high mortality rates. Many women died in childbirth, and surviving infants often died within their first year of life. The combination of poor nutrition, contaminated water, and lack of medical care created infant mortality rates that reached 50% in some urban areas. Families would have many children knowing that most would not survive to adulthood. Medieval city dwellers lived with the constant presence of death. Bodies lay in the streets for days before removal. Families would wake up to find relatives dead from disease or violence. This constant exposure to death created psychological trauma that affected entire communities. Children grew up understanding that death was always imminent. Many developed fatalistic attitudes, believing that suffering was inevitable and that life had little value. This psychological damage was passed down through generations. The extreme conditions of medieval city life broke down traditional social structures. Families would abandon sick relatives to avoid contamination. Neighbors would steal from each other to survive. The basic human bonds that hold communities together were destroyed by the struggle for survival. This social breakdown created additional stress and isolation for urban residents. People lived in constant fear of their neighbors, creating communities based on suspicion and mistrust rather than mutual support. The suffering of medieval city life led to extreme religious movements and practices. People would engage in self-flagellation, believing that physical suffering would earn divine forgiveness. Religious hysteria and fanaticism were common responses to the constant threat of death. Many urban residents believed that their suffering was divine punishment for sin, leading to additional guilt and psychological trauma. The church often reinforced these beliefs, teaching that earthly suffering was necessary for spiritual salvation. Medieval cities were filled with smoke from cooking fires, industrial operations, and waste burning. The air was so polluted that residents developed chronic respiratory problems. Coal burning, where available, created additional toxic emissions that contaminated entire neighborhoods. The combination of smoke, chemical fumes, and rotting organic matter created air quality that was toxic to human health. Residents developed chronic coughs, breathing difficulties, and lung diseases that often proved fatal. As we've discussed, water pollution was perhaps the most deadly aspect of medieval city life. Rivers and wells were contaminated with human waste, industrial chemicals, and rotting organic matter. This contamination created cycles of disease that affected entire populations. The lack of clean water meant that residents often turned to alcoholic beverages like beer and wine for daily hydration. While this provided some protection against waterborne diseases, it also created problems with malnutrition and alcohol-related health issues. The constant dumping of waste and toxic materials contaminated urban soil. Gardens and food production areas were poisoned by human waste, chemical runoff, and heavy metals. This contamination affected food safety and created additional health hazards. The contaminated soil also created problems with building foundations and structural integrity. Many buildings were constructed on contaminated ground that was unstable and hazardous to human health. Medieval cities created economic systems that trapped residents in cycles of poverty and disease. The majority of urban dwellers worked for subsistence wages that barely covered basic survival needs. This poverty made it impossible to improve living conditions or escape the deadly urban environment. The lack of economic mobility meant that families remained trapped in the same deadly conditions for generations. Children inherited their parents' poverty and had no opportunity to improve their circumstances. Urban workers were exploited by wealthy merchants and craft guilds who paid minimal wages while demanding long hours of dangerous work. Workers had no rights, no safety protections, and no recourse when injured or disabled by their work. This exploitation created additional stress and health problems for urban residents. The combination of dangerous working conditions, poor pay, and lack of job security created chronic stress that contributed to physical and mental health problems. Medieval cities were characterized by extreme wealth inequality. A small number of wealthy merchants and nobles lived in relative comfort while the majority of residents struggled to survive. This inequality created social tensions and contributed to the breakdown of community bonds. The wealthy could afford to escape the worst conditions of urban life by moving to separate neighborhoods or fleeing to the countryside during epidemic outbreaks. The poor had no such options and were trapped in the most dangerous parts of the city. Medieval cities represented humanity's first large-scale experiment in urban living, and the results were catastrophic. These urban environments combined the worst aspects of human civilization: overcrowding, poverty, disease, violence, and environmental destruction, into concentrated death traps that killed their inhabitants at horrific rates. The sanitation crisis, with its open sewers and contaminated water supplies, created perfect conditions for deadly diseases. The housing crisis forced families into overcrowded, dangerous buildings that collapsed or burned with frightening regularity. The food system poisoned residents with contaminated and adulterated products. Industrial operations filled the air and water with toxic chemicals. The social system broke down under the stress of constant death and suffering. Perhaps most tragically, these conditions were largely preventable. The knowledge and technology needed to create safer, healthier cities existed in other parts of the world and in earlier civilizations. The Roman Empire had demonstrated that large-scale urban sanitation was possible. Islamic cities had developed sophisticated medical knowledge and public health systems. Medieval European cities became death traps not because of technological limitations, but because of social, political, and economic failures. The lack of effective government, the breakdown of social institutions, and the extreme inequality of medieval society all contributed to creating urban environments that were fundamentally hostile to human life. The lessons from medieval cities remain relevant today. Urban planning, public health systems, and social safety nets are not luxuries. They are essential for human survival in large-scale communities. The medieval experience shows us what happens when these systems fail, creating environments where disease, poverty, and death become the norm rather than the exception. Today, as we face new challenges in urban development and public health, we must remember the horrific lessons of medieval cities. We must ensure that our modern urban environments support human life rather than destroying it, and that we never again create the conditions that made medieval cities the ultimate death traps in human history. The story of medieval cities serves as a stark reminder of how quickly civilization can collapse when basic human needs are ignored. It shows us the importance of sanitation, healthcare, education, and social support systems in creating livable communities. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the suffering experienced by millions of medieval city dwellers was not inevitable. It was the result of human choices and systems that prioritized profit over human life. As we continue to build and develop urban environments around the world, we must never forget the lessons learned from the medieval death traps. We must commit to creating cities that support human flourishing rather than human suffering, and we must ensure that the horrors of medieval urban life are never repeated.